Welcome to the Cognitive Edge. I'm Dr. Daniel Sable. Today, I want to talk about something that sounds simple at first, but becomes much more complicated the longer that you sort of start pondering it and you think about it. Um, when does offering help become dependency? How much help um, is dependence for students. Um, we spent decades trying to make learning easier. We give students calculators and spell checkers and search engines and educational apps, adaptive software, digital organizers, online tutorials, and now we have artificial intelligence. Most of these tools were really created for a good reason. They save time, they provide access, they remove unnecessary barriers, they can help students who are struggling, they can personalize instruction, they can allow students to accomplish things that once required considerably more time and effort. But there is also another side to this conversation. It's a pretty big one, and that side is what happens when the tool begins doing the very thinking we're trying to teach, um, and that is where help can become dependent. Uh, think about a simple example. Imagine a student learning multiplication. At some point, giving that student a calculator may be useful. But if the student never develops basic number sense because the calculator is always available, the technology has not simply assisted the student. It may have replaced part of the learning process. The calculator is not the problem. The timing of the calculator is really what matters. Now consider writing. Um, we have spell check that can be extremely useful, and grammar software that can help students recognize mistakes, and artificial intelligence can suggest better sentences, um, reorganize paragraphs, generate outlines, and even produce complete essays. I mean, again, none of these tools is automatically bad. The question is whether the student is still doing enough of his or her own cognitive work to develop, and they're learning the material that they're looking for. If a student writes a paragraph and uses AI to improve the grammar, that may represent assistance. I don't know. If the student asks AI to generate the entire paragraph and submits it without understanding how or why it was written, something very different has happened. The student has not merely just received help, the student has um, really outsourced their thinking. And that distinction may become one of the most important educational questions of the next decade. We often think of learning as acquiring information, but learning is also the process of building mental structures. We develop knowledge by retrieving information, making mistakes, recognizing patterns, solving problems, struggling with ideas, receiving feedback, and then trying again. Um, these processes are not always comfortable, learning can become very frustrating. Sometimes it's slow, sometimes students share at a problem. I'm just sorry, they'll stare at the problem and for 10 minutes before the answer begins to really make sense to them. Um, and educators naturally want to help, but there's the danger in rescuing students too quickly. Um, the moment of struggle may actually be the moment when learning is taking place. Um, Suppose a student is trying to write an introduction to an essay. The student, struggles. They write a sentence, they delete it. Really, they try another. They change the wording. Um, really rethink their argument. Um, that process may look inefficient, but cognitively, something important is happening. The student is learning how ideas become language. Now imagine really that instead of going through that process, the student tries or um, the student types the assignment into an AI system and receives a polished introduction within seconds. The final project might actually look better, but did the student become a better writer? You know, and that's the problem that schools are increasingly, having to confront and to um, to ask themselves. Um, we have traditionally judged learning by the quality of the finished product, but artificial intelligence is forcing us to reconsider that assumption. A polished product does not necessarily demonstrate a developed skill at all by any means. Sometimes the messy process matters more than the polished answer, honestly. All that clutter and scatter could lead to something. This is why I believe educators need to distinguish between scaffolding and what substitution is. Um, scaffolding really supports the learner while the learner continues doing the intellectual work. Substitution occurs when the technology performs the intellectual work instead. So, a teacher giving a student a hint is scaffolding. A teacher solving the entire problem is probably substitution. Um, a writing program identifying a grammatical error may be scaffolding, it may not be. An AI system generating the entire essay may become substitution. A research database helping students locate information is scaffolding. The AI system summarizing all of the resources so the student never reads may become a substitution. Difference is not always obvious. And that is exactly why schools need to talk about it. It's so important. And, there's another important concept here. We have this cognitive offloading. Humans have always used tools to reduce mental effort. Um, we write things down so we do not have to remember everything. And we use calendars to remember appointments and important days and times. Um, we use maps to navigate. We really use calculators to perform complex arithmetic. Um, we use search engines to retrieve information, and we, um, feel and we know that there's nothing r- inherently wrong with cognitive um, offloading. Um, in fact, the civilization depended upon it. The problem occurs when we offload a cognitive process before we have developed the underlying ability. That distinction matters tremendously in education. Consider GPS. GPS is like an extraordinary tool, and it's made everybody's lives just so much easier. But many people have experienced something interesting too. They can drive to a location several times using the GPS and still have difficulty finding it independently. Why? Because the GPS was doing the navigating. The person was following instructions, and um, those are not necessarily the same cognitive process. And, we can see something similar happening with artificial intelligence. Um, a student might use AI repeatedly to solve mathematical problems, organize essays, to summarize articles, or to generate study guides. The student may also complete more work. The student may even receive higher grades. Um, but if the technology disappears, what remains? What's going to remain here? That may become the ultimate test of whether assistance has turned into dependence. You want to ask the student, really, can you still perform the skill without the tool? Um, and if the answer is consistently no, then really, as the educator, it's somewhat should probably um, examine what is happening and start helping the student get that skill back. That's the, and it does not mean students should always work without technology. That would make little sense. Professionals use technology constantly, and we have the whole slew of people um, who use different things or different computers and processes or software. And so with that, the question becomes, is there enough trust there um, to say to yourself, okay, my students, they can do this, but surely without um, creating any problems or running into any troubles. Um, but students should, absolutely learn to use the tool they will encounter in the real world. There's a difference between learning a skill and automating a skill. Ideally, students will develop sufficient understanding first and then use technology to extend their capabilities of this idea. That brings us to a concept I think should uh, consider or be considered more carefully, which is productive struggle. Not all difficulty is useful. We should not make learning unnecessarily confusing or frustrating. But some difficulty, it really is essential. It really is. Students need opportunities and some time to wrestle with an idea, and they need to retrieve information from memory. Um, they need to really try to make predictions. Um, they need to revise their thinking. They need to encounter incorrect answers and figure out why those answers are incorrect. Um, Students, they need moments when the solution does not, immediately appear, because education is not about reaching the answer. It is about really developing the minds capable of producing the answer. And sometimes the fastest path to the answer is not the best path to learning. Um, Artificial intelligence makes this especially important. AI can provide answers almost instantly, but instant answers create a temptation, and um, with that temptation can come a lot of problems. Um, for instance, why struggle with a problem for 20 minutes when a machine can solve it in 20 seconds? That sounds reasonable until we remember that the 20 minutes of struggling may have been the education. The 20-second answer may simply be the product. But schools, therefore, they need to rethink the way they introduce AI. And instead of simply asking, how can students use AI? Um, we should also probably ask, um, when should students use AI? And perhaps even more importantly, um, when should they not? It's just, that's clear. Imagine if school developed different levels of AI use. During early skill development, students might, complete more work independently. Later, they can use AI for feedback, maybe. Um, After demonstrating proficiency, they might use AI to automate, routine components of the task. Um, you know, this has this has a lot to do with letting go in the classroom, and that's hard, I think. Eventually, they could use AI collaboratively to solve more sophisticated problems um, that would mirror the way expertise often develops. First learn the fundamentals, then learn the tools, finally learn how to combine human judgment with technological capability. The danger comes when we reverse that process. If students become experts at using tools before developing the knowledge needed to evaluate what the tools produce, they may become very efficient at generating answers that they cannot judge. And that creates another problem, which is verification. Artificial intelligence can produce information that sounds convincing, even when um, it is, incorrect. A knowledgeable student can question an answer. Um, an inexperienced student may simply accept what he or she is given. Knowledge, therefore, becomes more important, not less important. In an AI-rich environment, students need enough background knowledge to recognize when something doesn't sound right. You should be able to pick things up right away. Um, they need research skills. The students need information literacy skills. They need source evaluation. They need the ability to compare claims. Um, they need to understand evidence and um, this, is also where librarians have an increasingly important role. School librarians have spent decades teaching students how to locate information, how to evaluate sources, recognize bias, cite evidence, and conduct research. Artificial intelligence does not eliminate those responsibilities. Um, it magnifies them, I think. We're going to need a gatekeeper, and I believe that the librarian is going to be that person who kind of gatekeeps the AI and how it's working. Instead of simply teaching students how to find information, librarians and teachers increasingly have to really teach students how to question information generated for them. There is also an emotional side to dependence. Students, they need to develop confidence in their own abilities. Imagine a student who begins every assignment by asking AI what to write. Eventually the student may begin believing that they cannot start without it. That becomes more than, technical or technological dependence. It becomes, more intellectual dependence. Um, Really, the students may stop trusting their own ideas. Um, they may become afraid of producing an imperfect first draft. They may think everything must sound polished immediately and have everything done. But good thinking is often messy, as we know it. Good writing is often messy. Research is definitely messy, and we're well aware of that. And creativity is messy, and learning is definitely a messy process. Um, you know, we should really, yes, be careful about creating environments where students believe every answer must immediately look perfect. And that's part of another problem. Some of the most important learning happens during, revision. The first attempt is not supposed to be perfect. the um, that brings us back to the central question again of when does help become dependence? And it's a tough one. Perhaps the answer is this: help becomes dependence when the support repeatedly removes the cognitive work necessary to develop the underlying skill. A tool, it should expand human capability. It should not quietly replace the human capability before that capability has been developed. Um, that really does mean educators may need to ask three questions whenever introducing a technology. First, what skill are students supposed to develop? Second, what part of that skill is the technology performing? And third, what thinking remains for the students? These three um, questions could transform the way schools approach, educational technology. Um, because the goal should never be simply to make learning easier. The goal should be to make learning better. About making it better and better and better. Sometimes better learning is easier. Sometimes better learning is faster. But sometimes better learning requires difficulty. It requires patience. You know, it requires mistakes, and it requires thinking. And perhaps that's one of the biggest challenges facing education today. Um, Technology is becoming extraordinarily good at removing friction, so to speak. Education must decide which, which friction should disappear and which friction students still need. There's a difference between removing an obstacle and removing an opportunity to learn. The future should not be a battle between humans and technology. Students should use powerful tools. Yes. They should definitely use artificial intelligence. Yeah. Why not? Why wouldn't you use something that makes your life a little easier? They should really learn how to automate tasks, which is very important. And they should learn how to work efficiently. Um, but they should also develop the knowledge, the judgment, creativity, persistence, and independence necessary to know what those tools are doing. Technology should make capable people more capable. It should not really become a substitute for becoming capable in the first place. That's very important. So the next time that we introduce a new technology into a classroom, perhaps we should not begin by asking um, how much easier will this make the assignment, but maybe we should instead ask, um, what will the student still have to think about? And because the purpose of education is not simply producing correct answers, this, um, the purpose is developing people who can think when the answer is not immediately available. And that is where the line between help and dependence truly matter. I am Dr. Daniel Sable, and this is the Cognitive Edge, where we continue asking not simply what technology can do for education, but what education must continue doing for the human mind. Thanks for coming out and watching, and have a great night, everybody. Bye bye.